Hello everyone. Today we have an amazing story that will change your perspective on the future. Everly Whitaker, an ordinary woman, had a near-death experience and received a direct revelation from Jesus about the Antichrist and the challenges that lie ahead. This story is full of profound messages and warnings for all of us. Before we begin, comment below which city you are watching from. We want to know you. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and activate the bell so you don't miss any of our videos. Now get ready, because this story is going to give you goosebumps. My name is Everly Whitaker, and until the day of the accident, I believed I led an ordinary, even predictable life. We lived in Bloomington, Minnesota, a nice, safe suburb. My house was on a tree-lined street, with white fences and neighbors who greeted each other as they passed. My husband, Caleb, was a dedicated engineer, always busy with deadlines and projects, but a loving father to our children, Emma and Lucas. Emma, age 16, was dreamy and creative, while Lucas, at 14, had a more practical and skeptical personality, much like his father. I worked as a guidance counselor at the local school. I liked my work. He spent his days listening to the problems of teenagers, helping them navigate the uncertainties of youth. It was rewarding but sometimes exhausting. At night, I would often sit at the kitchen table, grading papers or reviewing reports, while Caleb worked in the office and the kids were in their rooms. Even though everything seemed in order, there was an emptiness that I couldn't explain. Maybe it was because my faith, although present, was not a solid pillar in my life. We attended church on special occasions, like Christmas and Easter, but I rarely took time for prayer or deep spiritual reflection. For me, God was more of a comforting idea than a real presence. I remember a conversation with Caleb a few weeks before the accident. "Everly, have you ever thought about taking a vacation alone?" he suggested, out of the blue while we were having breakfast. "Several times," I replied with a smile, trying to sound playful. "But I don't know if you and the children would survive without me," he laughed. But there was something in his expression that made me stop. Maybe he realized I was tired, or maybe it was the other way around, and he was tired of our monotonous routine. I didn't know I was on the verge of such a drastic change. For years my life was shaped by a desire for stability. It was as if I had built a protective bubble around myself and my family, but the bubble was about to burst. That day when I left for work, Caleb was distracted by his emails, and the kids were engrossed in their phones. There were no warm goodbyes or words of warning, just a hurried "Pion, Mom" from Emma as I grabbed my bag. As I drove, I felt an unusual uneasiness. Traffic was as usual, cars passing, traffic lights controlling the flow. I turned on the radio and the music was playing, but my mind wandered. Something felt wrong, but I didn't know what. It was a small but persistent sensation. I just wanted that day to be quick. There was nothing special in sight, just school meetings and councils. However, fate had other plans for me. That was the life I led up until that moment. An ordinary life, with its ups and downs, but with nothing that really tested my faith or made me question the greater purpose of it all. That day seemed like just another day on the calendar. Traffic was light, and the cloudy sky suggested that a light rain could fall at any time. On the radio, a pop song was playing softly, but I barely paid attention. My mind was occupied with the day's commitments, meetings with teachers, helping a student in crisis, and later, stopping by the supermarket before heading home. I was just a few blocks from school when it happened. I arrived at a busy intersection known for its heavy morning traffic. The light was green for me, so I continued, but something changed in an instant. It was as if time had slowed down. Before I even saw the truck, I felt a chill down my spine, a feeling that something was about to go terribly wrong. This intuition, so strong and sudden, was like a silent warning. Then I looked to my right, and there it was, a huge truck, coming towards me at an alarming speed. The driver had ignored the red light. There was no time to react. The impact was devastating. I remember the metallic sound of the shock, like the roar of thunder. My car was thrown like a toy, spinning violently until it hit a street sign post. The glass shattered, and for a moment, everything went dark. In the darkness, there was absolute silence. I felt no pain, just a strange lightness, as if I were floating. Suddenly, I began to hear voices and the distant sound of sirens. Little by little, I realized that I was no longer in the car, or at least not like before. I looked down and saw my body trapped in the wreckage, motionless. There was blood on my face and clothes, and the paramedics were working frantically to get me out of the vehicle. It was like watching a movie, Except I was the protagonist. A woman screamed in one of the cars stopped at the intersection. "Oh my God, she's dead, someone do something." Other onlookers gathered around, their faces full of horror. The paramedics continued their maneuvers, but in the background I heard one of them say something that chilled me. "We don't have a pulse. Stop time. 4 minutes and counting. 4 minutes." For them, it was the time I was lifeless. To me, it seemed like an eternity. However, instead of panic, I felt an inexplicable peace. It was as if an invisible presence was holding me, comforting me. I floated above the scene, observing everything with an eerie calm. The paramedics continued to try to revive my body. I could clearly see every detail, the sweat running down their faces, the compressions on my chest. But I knew, somehow, that my earthly life was no longer under their control. It was then that everything changed. A bright light appeared in front of me, radiating warmth and love. It wasn't like sunlight. It was more intense, more welcoming, like an invitation to a place that I knew, without understanding how, was my true home. I was drawn to the light. Everything around me began to disappear. The sounds, the images, the worries of the physical world. The peace was intensifying, and I knew something extraordinary was about to happen. As I approached the light, I felt every trace of fear or doubt evaporate. There were no more sirens, human voices or sounds of the physical world. Everything was enveloped in a serene silence, as if the universe had paused to give me this moment. The light wasn't just a blinding glow, it was alive, pulsating, and filled with something I can only describe as pure love. Floating toward it, I realized I was no longer bound by the limitations of my body. It was as if I were just consciousness, a fragment of conscious energy. There was no heaviness, pain, or tiredness. I looked down again and saw my body trapped in the wreckage of the car, but strangely enough, I felt no attachment to it. I knew that body was part of me, but at that moment, it seemed irrelevant. As I approached the light, a feeling of familiarity washed over me. It was like meeting a long-lost friend. Words failed to describe what I felt. It was a mix of absolute peace, joy, and a deep sense of belonging. I was greeted by an invisible but unmistakable presence. There were no words, but direct communication, as if every part of my being understood what was being conveyed. Shortly after, I began to see flashes of my own past. It was like a curtain was being lifted, showing important scenes from my life. The day Emma was born, the moment Caleb and I bought our first house, and even little moments of kindness that I had forgotten, like helping a student in crisis. Each scene was accompanied by a feeling of learning, as if each experience had a greater purpose. Soon, the light seemed to completely envelop me, and suddenly, I was in a different space. It was difficult to describe. It wasn't a physical place, but it had a tangible presence. It felt like I was in a field of living energy, filled with peace and harmony. There was no time, just an eternal now. Suddenly, I felt another presence. It was unlike anything I had ever experienced. It was personal, loving, but at the same time imposing. Without a doubt, I knew who it was, Jesus. It was not necessary for him to introduce himself. I just knew. He didn't look like the images I had seen in pictures or movies. There was no long beard or white robe. It was more of an essence, a presence of love and authority that radiated wisdom and compassion. When he spoke, it was not with words, but with a communication that reverberated in every fiber of my being. "Everly, you are not here by chance. I have something to show you, something the world needs to know." I felt a mix of reverence and gratitude. There was no fear, just a deep desire to understand. "What do I need to know?" I asked, without moving my lips, but knowing that he would understand. There are things to come, big changes, big challenges, but there is also hope. You need to see it so you can share it. As he spoke, the light around us seemed to pulse, and I knew I was about to receive something extraordinary. It was the beginning of something that would completely change the way I saw the world. Around Jesus' presence, the light seemed to vibrate with a living energy. It wasn't just the intensity of the glow that touched me, but the way it seemed to hold all the answers to life's deepest questions. His presence was not oppressive, but completely enveloping, like the warmth of a hug on a cold night. He was love personified, but he also radiated a wisdom that transcended all human understanding. "Everly, I'm going to show you what's coming, but first, you need to understand what's at stake." His voice was like a melody, soundless, but felt in every particle of my existence. I felt my heart, or what was left of my essence, fill with a mixture of awe and reverence. There were no doubts, just a complete surrender to what he wanted to show me. Jesus extended something that was not a physical hand, but an extension of his light. Suddenly, images began to appear around us, as if we were watching a movie, but with a clarity beyond any earthly projection. The first visions were of destruction. Earthquakes, tsunamis, and hurricanes devastated entire cities. Desperate people sought refuge, but the chaos seemed to consume everyone. I saw people running, some in despair, others trying to help, but the scale of the disasters was incomprehensible. These are the difficult times that are coming, consequences of how humanity has chosen to live, Jesus explained, without judgment in his voice, but with a deep sadness. Then the scenes changed. I saw economies crumbling, countries plunged into financial crises, people fought for food, water, and safety. The collapse seemed to trigger a wave of global violence and despair. However, in the midst of the chaos, a man emerged. He was charismatic, eloquent, and seemed to radiate confidence. He promised solutions, peace, and prosperity. Millions gathered to listen to him, celebrating his leadership and innovative proposals. "Who is he?" I asked, with an anguish that I couldn't contain. "He's the Antichrist, Everly. He will come as a savior, but his intentions will be dark." Jesus showed me how this man would use advanced technology to control the masses. I saw global digital currencies being implemented, promising to make life easier, but turning into an instrument of surveillance and oppression. I saw devices and systems that promised comfort and security, but that secretly monitored every movement, every thought. He will use people's desire for peace and stability to imprison them, Jesus continued. He will bring a new spirituality, something that will seem to unify all beliefs, but will be poison for the soul. The images changed again. I saw people who refused to follow this system being persecuted, isolated and marginalized. They could not buy food, work, or access basic services. However, even in the midst of persecution, I saw small groups resisting. They were gathered together, praying, protected by a force that seemed invisible but unbreakable. "These are my faithful ones," said Jesus, with a radiance in his presence that seemed to grow. "They will not bow to deception. They will be my light in the darkness." I was astonished, but an inexplicable hope began to form within me. "Why me?" I asked, with tears that were not physical but deeply felt. "Why are you showing me this?" "Because you have a role to play," he replied. "You must share what you saw, so that those who are willing to listen can prepare themselves. The key to resisting deception is not in material resources, but in a deep relationship with myself." The words echoed inside me, like a seed planted in fertile soil. I knew my life would never be the same. Then Jesus raised his light again, and everything around me began to change. I knew I was about to see something even deeper. As soon as Jesus raised his light again, the landscape around us changed. I was enveloped by a new sequence of visions. These weren't just scenes, they were experiences. I could feel the fear, the pain, and, at times, the hope of the people living through the events he was showing me. The first vision was unprecedented global chaos. Natural disasters devastated entire cities. I saw a monstrous hurricane consuming a densely populated coast, sweeping away buildings, vehicles, and people. Elsewhere, an earthquake of unimaginable magnitude cracked the ground, swallowing entire cities. I saw tsunamis sweeping across lands, leaving only wreckage and despair in their wake. People were desperate, but not united. I saw uprisings in countries previously considered stable. I saw nations at war over basic resources like water and food. Humanity seemed to be in collapse, trapped in a cycle of destruction and suffering. "These events are not punishments, but consequences," Jesus explained. "They are the result of human choices, of the destruction of what was given to be cared for." The vision changed to something even more disturbing. A man emerged from the chaos. He had a magnetic, almost hypnotic presence. People followed him blindly, applauded his promises of a better future, and clamored for his solutions. He spoke of global unity, of a new era of peace and prosperity, but something in his gaze bothered me. There was no compassion there, just a calculated coldness. "This is the Antichrist," said Jesus. "He will be seen as a savior, but he will lead the world into deception." I saw how he introduced advanced technologies that promised to solve world problems. I saw global digital currencies replacing physical cash, and people embracing this change with enthusiasm. I saw devices that promised health, safety, and comfort, but secretly monitored my every move and thought. Under his leadership, a system of totalitarian control was implemented. People who accepted this system lived seemingly in harmony, but they were spiritually empty, trapped in a carefully orchestrated illusion. He will use the human desire for peace and stability to enslave you, Jesus said. The vision then changed again. I saw those who resisted. They were few, spread out in small communities, but they were spiritually connected. They were marginalized and persecuted, prevented from buying, selling, or participating in society. I saw families living in forests, caves, and remote places, but with an unbreakable light within them. They are mine, Jesus explained. They will understand that true freedom is not in this world, but in me. I saw scenes of persecution, men and women being arrested, families separated, children being forced to choose between their parents and the system. But even in the midst of this, these communities maintained an unshakable faith. Jesus then showed me something that warmed my heart. Amidst the darkness, there were small spots of light. There were groups of believers, praying together, singing hymns and sharing hope. Despite persecution, they were protected in ways that seemed miraculous. They will be the light in the darkness, said Jesus. You must warn them and prepare them. I felt a rush of overwhelming responsibility. These visions weren't just for me, they were a call to action. Jesus then turned to me. His gaze was both gentle and firm. The deception will be subtle, Everly. Promises of peace and prosperity and technological advances will seduce many. But you saw the truth. Now share it. The visions began to fade, and the light around us became softer. I knew there was so much more to learn, but I also knew that my time there was coming to an end. After the overwhelming visions, I was immersed in a sense of peace, but also of urgency. The light around us softened, and Jesus stood before me. His presence radiated unconditional love, but also a firmness that said what he would reveal to me was vitally important. Everly, you saw what's coming, but don't lose yourself in fear, he said, looking at me deeply. The deception will be powerful, but those who are with me in truth will not be defeated. I was silent, absorbing his words. My heart burned with a mixture of purpose and fear. The deception will seem irresistible, he continued. The Antichrist will use human weaknesses to build his empire. The desire for security, comfort, and quick solutions. It will offer technology to connect everyone, an economic system that promises equality, and a spirituality that will seem to unite the world. I wanted to interrupt, to ask how we could resist something so seductive, but before I could, he answered my question. You need to warn people. Many will not listen. Some will mock, others will be paralyzed by fear, but there are those who will recognize the truth and act. For these, your mission will be essential. I couldn't contain my words. But how, Lord? How can someone like me face something so great? He came closer, and I felt his light envelop me like a warm hug. It won't be you alone, Everly. I will be with you, always. The key to resisting deception is not in strength or material resources, but in a personal relationship with myself. There is no greater power than the love we have when we are connected. These words brought a peace I had never experienced. But he didn't finish. I want you to remember this. Anything that looks good to human eyes will not be good for the soul. Technology will be a powerful tool, but also a trap. The universal spirituality they will offer will appear full of light, but it will be a shadow of who I am. They will try to erase my image, replace it with something shaped by the world's desires. He then showed me one last vision. Families gathered together, praying in silence. They were not in large churches, but in simple houses, forests and open fields. These people were connected, not by digital systems, but by an unshakable spiritual bond. These are my faithful. They will face difficulties, but I will give them strength. This is how you should live, Everly. Don't look for grandiose signs. Seek the truth in everyday life. I felt a new determination rise within me. My fear gave way to a clear conviction. This message needed to be shared. You saw the future and received the truth, but he also saw hope. I want you to take this to the world. Tell them not to be seduced by the easy, the immediate. Tell them to resist and trust me. Jesus then lifted up his light again. She enveloped me with an intensity that was almost overwhelming, but at the same time restorative. "Get ready, Everly. Your mission begins now." Everything around me began to dissolve again. I felt his presence moving away, but his words remained engraved in my soul. One last sentence echoed as the light began to fade. "Remember, I will be with you until the end." The transition back was abrupt and jarring. In a moment, I was enveloped in the radiant light of Jesus, filled with peace and purpose. In the next instant, I was ripped away from that place and thrown back into my physical body. The sensation was like falling from a great height, an impact that made me gasp, as if my body was relearning how to breathe. I opened my eyes and was immediately confronted by the reality around me. I was in the hospital, with fluorescent lights shining above me and hurried voices echoing. The first thing I saw was the astonished face of a doctor, who seemed unable to believe what was happening. "She's back," he shouted, almost tripping as he walked away to call the others. My body felt heavy, as if I were tied to something that didn't belong to me. It was strange to feel physical pain again, after experiencing the lightness of the other dimension. My chest burned, my head throbbed, and every part of me seemed to scream in protest. But something inside me was different. It was as if my soul had been replenished, illuminated by a truth that the physical world could not erase. A nurse appeared at my side, eyes wide with surprise. "Are you well? Can you hear us?" I tried to respond, but my throat was dry and my voice came out hoarse. "I am here." The doctor returned, accompanied by more people, all with expressions of shock and disbelief. One of them, apparently the team leader, was examining me as if he were witnessing a miracle. "You were declared clinically dead for more than 4 minutes, he said, his voice thick with emotion. There were no signs of brain activity, no response. I can't explain it. I knew the answer, but I didn't say anything at that moment. I just closed my eyes, trying to absorb what was happening. Some time later, Caleb entered the room, looking disoriented and shaken. He was holding Emma's hand, who had tears streaming down her face, and Lucas was right behind, his eyes full of fear and relief. "Everly," Caleb called, his voice shaking. He approached quickly, squeezing my hand tightly. You came back." "I'm here," I replied with difficulty, trying to smile to reassure them. Emma approached, sobbing. "I thought I lost you, Mum." "No, dear. I'm fine now," I whispered, even though refined Gilles wasn't an accurate description of how I felt. Lucas stood in the background, watching in silence. His eyes were full of questions, but he seemed hesitant to voice them. As they stood there, I realized that despite being surrounded by love, my life had changed irrevocably. I wasn't the same anymore. The experience I lived transformed me, and now I carried a truth that I could not ignore. Later, when the medical team left, Caleb held my hand again. "What happened, Everly? The doctor said you weren't supposed to be alive, and yet, here you are, as if nothing had happened." I looked into his eyes, feeling the importance of that moment. I knew I would need to tell him the truth, but I also knew he might not understand. "I saw something, Caleb, something that changed everything. I'll tell you, but I need time to organize my thoughts." He nodded, reluctant but respectful. "All good. I am here." As he spoke, I felt a mixture of gratitude and fear. Returning to my body, I knew the hardest journey was just beginning. I had to find the courage to share what I had seen and accept the consequences. My physical recovery was surprisingly quick. For doctors, it was almost a miracle. Despite suffering a serious accident and spending more than 4 minutes without brain activity, there was no permanent damage. However, what no one knew, what I was still processing, was that the biggest transformation had happened within me. In the first few days after the accident, Caleb and the kids were always by my side, trying to help me get back to normal. But what they didn't understand was that I didn't want to go back to normality. My worldview had changed. The near-death experience, NDE, had left me with a purpose that I couldn't ignore, even if it complicated my life. The morning after returning home, I sat at the kitchen table with Caleb. He had made coffee and was reading the news on his cell phone, but I noticed that he often looked away from me. Finally, he broke the silence. "Everly, we need to talk. You came back from the hospital different. I know something happened." His voice was calm, but there was concern in his eyes. I took a deep breath, feeling that this moment was inevitable. "Caleb, during the time my heart stopped, I had an experience. I saw things that I can't fully explain, but I know they were real." He frowned, clearly trying to process my words. Things. Like what? I was taken to a place of light where I found Jesus. He showed me the future, things to come, things we need to know to prepare. Caleb placed the coffee mug on the table, looking at me with a mix of skepticism and concern. Everly, you went through something traumatic. Don't you think maybe this could be your mind trying to deal with the accident? No, I replied firmly. It wasn't my mind. It was something much bigger than me. The conversation ended without a satisfactory outcome. Caleb clearly wanted to believe me, but his practical and skeptical nature stopped him. This became a constant in the following weeks. He supported me in every practical way, but when I tried to share more about what I had seen, he would withdraw, change the subject, or simply remain silent. My children reacted in different ways. Emma, curious and intuitive, was the first to show openness. One afternoon, while we were folding clothes, she asked me, "Mum, what did you see when you were, out of here?" I sat next to her and carefully explained part of what Jesus showed me. She listened intently, eyes wide. "And do you think this will really happen?" she asked, hesitantly. "Yes, Emma, but I also believe that there is hope, and that God will give us the strength to face whatever comes." Lucas, on the other hand, was more reserved. One night, I heard him and Caleb talking in the office. "Dad, do you think Mom is making this up?" Lucas asked, his voice low, but full of doubt. "I don't think she's making it up, son. I think she believes what she saw." This dynamic made my journey even more challenging. On the one hand, I felt an overwhelming responsibility to share my experience and warn the world. On the other, I struggled with doubt and skepticism from those closest to me. It was then that I decided to seek support outside of home. I began attending a small local church led by Pastor David Albright, a gentleman with deep spiritual insight. After listening to my story, he welcomed me as a spiritual mentor. "Everly, your experience is a calling. Don't let skepticism discourage you. Share your truth with those who are ready to listen." It was advice that gave me strength to move forward. Gradually, I began speaking at church meetings and small community groups. Some people reacted with incredulity, but others came to me with tears in their eyes, sharing their own experiences and confirming what I had seen. My life would never be the same, but now I knew I wasn't alone. Despite the challenges, I was determined to fulfill the mission that Jesus had entrusted to me. As the months passed, the urgency I felt to share my experience only increased. Every time I remembered Jesus' words, his warnings, and the unconditional love I felt in his presence, it was like a fire lit inside me. I knew I couldn't stay silent. My mission was clear: to warn people about impending deception and help them strengthen their relationship with God. It was Pastor David who suggested that I start speaking to larger audiences. "Everly, your story cannot be limited to this circle. You need to reach more people. Maybe record a video or organize community meetings." The idea intimidated me. I was just a school counselor, an ordinary mom from Bloomington, Minnesota. Who would listen to me? Who would believe me? However, I knew I couldn't let fear stop me. If Jesus trusted me with this mission, I should trust him to guide my steps. My first public performance was at a neighboring church, where Pastor David introduced me as a special guest. The room was full, and I could feel the weight of expectations in people's gazes. My heart was pounding as I took the stage, but an unearthly calm came over me as soon as I began to speak. "My name is Everly Whitaker, and a few months ago I died." The words echoed in the room, and the silence was absolute. I told my story, from the accident to the moment I met Jesus and the visions he showed me. I spoke about the charismatic leader who would emerge, about the use of technology as a weapon of control, and about the persecution of those who would resist. I also shared the message of hope, that even in the midst of darkness, God's light would shine through his believers. At the end, a woman from the audience approached with tears streaming down her face. "Thank you for sharing this. I always felt like something was wrong in the world, but I didn't know how to explain it. Now it makes sense." Others came too, some with questions, others with their own stories of spiritual experiences. Each conversation reinforced my resolve. However, not everyone reacted positively. At a community meeting, a man stood up in the middle of my speech. "This is just fanaticism and paranoia. The world is changing, yes, but we need advances, not this kind of superstition." His voice echoed in the room, causing a murmur among those present. I took a deep breath before responding. "Sir, I'm not here to create fear, but to warn. Each of you has the freedom to believe or not. My mission is to share what I saw and the truth I was entrusted with. Despite moments like this, the positive impact was greater. People began to gather in small groups to study the Bible, pray, and discuss how they could prepare themselves spiritually for what was to come. At every step, I saw signs that the message was touching hearts. At home, things remained challenging. Caleb still struggled to understand my change, but he wasn't opposed. Emma began accompanying me to some meetings, absorbing everything with curiosity. Lucas, although still skeptical, seemed more receptive, especially when he saw people's emotional reactions to my story. One night, as I read the Bible in the living room, Emma sat next to me. "Mom, do you think I'm ready to face all this? I mean, what future did you see?" I put the book aside and held his hands. "No one is quite ready, Emma, but if you keep your faith in God and seek the truth from Him, you will be prepared for whatever comes." These moments of connection gave meaning to my mission. I knew the path would be long and full of obstacles, but I was determined to continue. My voice was small compared to the noise of the world, but it was the voice God chose to use, and that was enough to keep me going. Despite all the challenges, Jesus' vision of small groups of believers persisted in my mind as a promise of hope. In the midst of the chaos and persecution I had seen, He had shown communities full of light, where faith was unbreakable and God's love flowed among people. I clung to that image when tiredness and doubt threatened to consume me. I started organizing meetings in my own home. The first was small, with just a few people from the local church and a few close friends. I shared my story again, but this time the focus was on the hope that Jesus conveyed. What I saw wasn't just destruction and deceit, I explained, looking at each attentive face around the room. I saw courage, faith, and God's victory even in the darkest moments. These meetings began to grow, attracting people from outside the city, some even from other states. They came with doubts, curiosity, and, in many cases, their own stories of spiritual experiences. The testimonies were varied, but they all shared a common theme: the need to seek a deeper relationship with God. One night during one of these meetings, a man named Robert stood up. He was a war veteran and with a serious look and the upright posture of someone used to discipline. "I never believed in those things," he said, crossing his arms. "But after listening to you, I realize there's something bigger going on. I'm scared, but I want to understand how I can protect my family." I looked at him with compassion. "The best protection is not physical, Robert. It's spiritual. Strengthen your faith, seek the truth, and teach this to your family. God will take care of the rest." Robert nodded, and after that he began bringing his wife and children to meetings. He ended up becoming one of the leaders of a small study group that emerged in a neighboring city. These small groups began to multiply. People shared the message in their communities, creating networks of support and spiritual resistance. They were not based on fear, but on love and unshakable faith. The hope that Jesus had shown me was becoming a reality before my eyes. However, with the growth of these groups also came challenges. Some members faced hostility from their families or communities, while others dealt with internal doubts. I myself faced moments of uncertainty, especially when the signs of the deception that Jesus had shown me began to appear in the world. Technological advances were heralded as miraculous solutions to global problems. Global digital currencies began to be discussed in economic forums, and the idea of universal spirituality was gaining strength in political and social circles. Each headline felt like a grim reminder of the visions I had received. But at the same time, I saw the strength of faith communities growing. Small acts of kindness and courage stood out amidst the disturbing news. A young man in one of the groups decided to distribute Bibles in areas where scripture reading was being discouraged. A family opened their home to welcome people who had lost everything in natural disasters. These stories gave me strength to continue. One night, while looking at the starry sky in my backyard, Emma came to sit next to me. "Mom, do you think we can really make a difference? We are so small compared to the rest of the world." I smiled at her, remembering Jesus' words, "Never underestimate the power of light, Emma. Even the smallest flame can illuminate the greatest darkness." She smiled back, and at that moment I felt like my mission was being passed on. It wasn't just about what I could do, but about what these communities and future generations could accomplish together. I knew the darkness would come, but I also knew that the final victory was already assured. I conclude my story with an appeal. Don't be fooled by what is attractive and easy. Seek the truth, strengthen your faith, and remain vigilant. The difficulties may be great, but God's love is greater. And, as Jesus told me, even in the midst of darkness, there will be light. And that light, no matter how small it may seem, will never be turned off.